Hello, everyone. Joshua Gilliland here. I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. With me today is Judge Matthew Sciarrino and Thomas Harper. It's a Sunday evening. Everyone's home and on a holiday weekend to talk about one of our favorite things in the universe, and that's Star Wars. And we're going to address one of the issues from The Rise of Skywalker with the issue of Stormtroopers. So in The Rise of Skywalker, we end up on one of the other moons of Endor. It's Kef Burr. It's the ocean moon, and we find a character named Jannah. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You can ask Lando.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Lando's full name. Who was Stormtrooper TZ-1719, who deserted after the Battle of Ansett Island, where she was with Company 77, and everyone there deserted after being ordered to fire on civilians. And her quote is, "They told us to fire on civilians. We wouldn't do it. We laid down our weapons." And she had been kidnapped as a small child and drafted into First Order service, raising all kinds of fun issues. And both Judge Sciarrino and Thomas, being JAG officers and having military law experience, I wanted their insights in being able to address, how do we classify everyone? What are the issues here? And so we'll start first with addressing the First Order, and starting first with Judge Sciarrino and then to Thomas. How would you define the First Order? Is it a military? Is it a gang? Is it a political group? What are your thoughts, Your Honor?
I think at this point in the the Star Wars chronological order, it really is a political group at this point. They've displaced the Republic. Clearly, in their beginning of the First Order, they were not a legitimate government, so you can make them more akin to a terrorist organization. But at this point in Star Wars, they've kind of won, and they have a leader. They have a government of sorts. They're taking over the Republic territory. So at the time of Rise of Skywalker, arguably they are a dictatorship, but they are a government of sorts, and I think you can make more of a case for them being a competing governmental entity than just a terrorist organization, which they were at the point that they were kidnapping these children in the beginning.
Thomas, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm with the judge. I think it's really key to recognize this evolution that we don't really see it fully played out in Rise of Skywalker because there's just too much other stuff going on. But certainly, if you watch the Resistance show and have read any of the background material and just kind of pick up on some of the lines that they allude to, the First Order has evolved from The Last Jedi as this, from this, I would call them a group of maybe unlawful combatants. In other words, a military force with no real legal right to be fighting or to declare war. I mean, they don't, in that movie, represent any kind of sovereign land body or geographical area. It's just this massive military force that is nomadic in nature. They just they don't have any roots anywhere. But now they control territory. They've taken over and continue to take over territories. There's a great example in Rise of Skywalker on Kijimi where Poe is talking to Zori Bliss, and it's clear that they've been there for a while. She talks about this operation. Not only do you see troops occupying Kijimi, which is something you don't see. You don't see First Order troops in occupation mode in either of the other two movies. But she talks about their, I would call it, recruitment with heavy air quotes around it, methods to fill their ranks, which is something.
It's kind of like aggressive negotiations.
Yeah, it's not strictly their land, but now it is, and so I would call them something like a hybrid sovereign state. I mean, a sovereign state under international law, basically the four corners, you've got a political entity that represents a geographical area. And I think setting their legitimacy aside, you can make an argument now that in some way, shape, or form, the First Order is now fits that bill, especially with the destruction of the New Republic.
Would you kind of compare them to the Taliban before like running the government in Afghanistan? They kind of go from the religious zealot movement to they're actually in charge. Is that a fair comparison?
A little bit. I would almost say like the ISIS caliphate is even a more, because the Taliban now control a huge chunk of Afghanistan, but they're not quite back to where they were, say, in 2000, 2001. But ISIS at its peak, that really struck me or strikes me as the First Order incarnate, where they move in with this hammer blow in terms of rapid military application of military force. And then all of a sudden they're administering taxes. They've got like an ad hoc judicial system, all these hallmark, they've got employees that are salaried, as bizarre as that seems. And I hate to bring an awful organization like that any comparison in the Star Wars universe, but the First Order is not great. And so the parallel, I think, is there.
All right, well, let's get into the next issue of comparing how the First Order operates in its recruitment, which is, again, in air quotes, because there are multiple ways to look at recruitment. We in the Clone Wars, we have the Republic cloning an army. And yeah, there's also a standing military, so people obviously were joining to become officers. So the Captain Tarkins and other admirals that we saw in the Clone Wars animated series. In the Imperial era, there was recruitment that we saw in Solo. Han joined, he saw the recruiting picture and he wanted to get out of the situation he was in, so he enlisted. And we've seen enlistment to the First Order with Tam on Star Wars Resistance, but prior to them, they're not. I don't want to acknowledge them as legitimate, because doing a decapitation strike on a government killing billions, and people and senators still live. So I don't think the survivors of the New Republic are going to say like, "Hey, we're done." But that's not addressed on screen. Maybe we'll get more in the animated series. That
if killing of millions makes you a non-legitimate government, then clearly the communist takeover of China and of the Soviet Union, where they, as part of their quest for legitimacy, purged millions and millions of people. But no one's going to make the argument that neither China nor Russia are legitimate governments today. But they certainly have their government based on a significant loss of life.
Yeah, and I would liken. I think that's a really good example, Judge, because I think you get this element of, it's not that anyone wants to accede to these governments. Like, nobody in the galaxy wants to admit that the First Order has any right to do this. But you see, whether it's in the movies or some of the outside materials, folks feel like they have no choice. This threat of hopelessness is kind of there. And so they just shrug. And just like folks, unwillingly knuckled under in real life in those places you're talking about, that's what we see play out here.
Agreed, which is, again, the deeper look at Star Wars of like, what is this comparable to? But it does raise issues with like how they did their, they kidnapped children to raise them as child soldiers so they would have a standing army. And that's radically different than the Empire. And I would argue it was worse than the Empire. It's one thing to get drafted. It's another thing for children to be kidnapped.
But not radically different than the Jedi.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
true.
and like that always, and there seemed to be some weird force of law with that, and um, a couple episodes at least hint at it in the Clone Wars of the race, the episodes, and I'm blanking on the names of the episodes, but it's Jar Jar and Mace Windu, and it's Jar Jar had a love interest who was queen of this planet,
Queen
and
Julia
yeah,
Bardata.
Yes.
is it the Night Witch, or I'm blanking on her name, but a evil Force user, and they discuss the issue of that nation felt that the Jedi were trying to kidnap children, and they weren't happy about that, and
And they
uh,
were themselves Force users. I mean, that was it wasn't like a planet that said, hey, you're not welcome here. We don't like what you're doing. These were powerful Force users that broke with the Jedi and said, you know what, you take your practice elsewhere. We're good without it.
yeah, again, that's something that always bothered me about the prequels of Jedi either adopting children, and there's force of law for parents to give up their parental rights to the Jedi. That always just seemed weird and wrong. Uh,
And even as an extension off that, Josh, I mean, you bring up a good point with the Clone Wars show. There are several episodes that deal with the agency of the clone army. I mean, this is an entity, a force of living beings that's treated like chattel. But again and again, we see these, I would call them isolated instances, but where some clones buck that trend. Universally, I think you see clones see themselves as more than just property that's been created to fight this war. And I look at the First Order's tactics here, and it makes you a little more squeamish because it's kids and whatnot. But the scene where Obi-Wan looks down on the training room on Camino, and it's a bunch of young Daniel Logans all train, and what they're training for. They're not sitting there doing algebra and learning to code. They're doing combat simulations. That still sends a shiver down my spine.
And
yeah,
even the different way that the Jedi generals treated those clone troops, because you had Anakin, who I argue was one of the nicer generals in that he really recognized that they were, separate entities, that their lives had value. And you had some generals that they were just basically battle fodder. And it
Mm-hmm.
didn't matter how many clones we lost. Whereas Anakin, time and time again, put his own life on the line to rescue clone troopers.
Yeah.
the Yodas in that camp, uh, Kenobi, in seeing that these individuals have agency, value, and the idea of breeding a clone army, because that's what it was, they were breeding soldiers, that's messed up on so many levels, versus kidnapping children. And when they're just being bred in a test tube, the civilian population can sleep at night because it's like, hey, it's not my kid who's getting drafted. Which, again, real world examples of having an active draft really upsets people when 18-year-olds go off to go get shot at in South Vietnam. On the flip side, kidnapping children makes it personal to those who are resisting the First Order, or going like, who the hell are these guys, and why are they stealing children in the middle of the night?
And Lando, to some extent, in Rise of Skywalker, brings that home when he tells this, the story of him losing his child, and there was more in the script that they were going to make that direct connection between her and Lando, and it's a little bit more subtle. I think it'll probably be developed in some of the books and the comics down the road, but that with a clone, there is no parent. I mean, there's a DNA donor, but for all of these First Order troopers, arguably, there was some parent that lost their child. Now, I also would have the feeling that some of the poorer people in the universe might have given up their child, or they might have raided various orphanages, as well as stealing from parents directly, as well as the downtrodden children of the galaxy. That might have been a right place to farm these children. But yeah, for the most part, I think they were literally stealing them from parents, and there's really no way in law that could ever be justified with regards to what they did.
No, and it's a super secretive program. They don't go into a ton of the details of the program. You definitely can tell from The Force Awakens forward that this is a program that has not just conscripted folks at the age of 18, say, but it is gotten folk. I mean, Hux has the line, my soldiers are conditioned from birth, that sort of thing. But you see it's laid down that the sort of secrecy of this entire program and just how sinister it is comes out in that Battlefront 2 game, that the actual story mode. I think it's the expansion where resistance forces or an arm of the New Republic discovers that there's this project going on, that it's this wide scale. It's called Project Resurrection is what they call it. But it's this sinister attempt, not even just to take kids, but to really, from the moment that they come into the First Order's arms, brainwash them and condition them to believe, all the propaganda, the entirety of the First Order. That's all they know. And I think that to me, taking somebody that was a human being, had a life to some extent even as a kid, brainwashing them, wiping them, and hitting the reset button and reprogramming them, so to speak. That's an extra special level of sinister. And I say that the folks listening can't see this, but the judge has a First Order Stormtrooper looming over his shoulder, watching all of us.
One of those cool little robot toys. So yes, we are all nerds who collect all the swag. So yeah, yeah. I have my R2 unit that I made at Galaxy's Edge by me. So yes, there's
we're balancing the force.
Yeah, the nerd is strong. But thinking of this issue of, like, if a parent lost a kid, and again, I would expect Lando to wear that more on his sleeve, and that was a missed opportunity on screen for him to say, like, my child was kidnapped, which is why I'm still around. On the flip side, you think he would be more motivated to get back into the fight because of that. That said, the entire idea of conditioning human beings to do unspeakable things, fire on civilians, go pillage, that's a lot. I mean, there were experiments in the 60s, like that, whether it was the Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, of showing like how people could behave very badly if they're put into a position of authority, and an authority figure is telling them to do something bad. There was one done in Nuremberg, and it was an actor who was supposed to be giving answers, and the test subject was supposed to give the actor an electrical shot if they got something wrong. And it was something like over 80% of those who participated in the study would have given a lethal dose of electricity to the actor. And that's just disturbing on so many levels, that if you just put somebody in a white coat acting as an authority figure, in order to, would you say no? It's why I think the character of Finn is so compelling, because he's like the one guy at My Lai who says, no, I'm not going to shoot civilians. And again, that was one guy. And I remember seeing an interview with him when I was in high school in Roger Halstead's War and Peace class. And I think the documentary was An Afternoon in My Lai. And I think that was a British production, but I could be wrong, because that was 1993, so that was a while ago, long time ago. That said, Finn's compelling. So when we get to Company 77, individuals who've been kidnapped, say no to firing on civilians. And again, let's just, get this out there. Firing on civilians is a war crime. Thomas, you've advised people on the law of war. Could you just help us break that down on why that's a war crime and why that's an illegal order?
The legal term for that is it's a no-no. No, it's so that I think at its core, what it boils down to is you have war may be chaos, but there are boundary lines drawn, and one of the most important boundary lines is between combatants and non-combatants. And civilians, by definition, are non-combatants and are, barring some special circumstance, i.e. them taking direct part in hostilities or something like that, they're out of bounds. They're not a legitimate, lawful military target.
And unfortunately, you also have the situation where, the human shield type situation where they will put, a generally not one of your best governments will literally put civilians, put a weapon structure in a hospital next to each other, so that unfortunately the collateral damage does kill civilians. But yeah, you're not targeting the civilians, you're targeting a legitimate military target.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a total difference between, and I realize that for folks that have not been enmeshed in this or practiced in this area, it can seem like a distinction without a difference maybe, and cold and calculating. But there's a difference between a civilian unfortunately getting killed in what is otherwise a legitimate military operation. Otherwise, the judge's comment about collateral damage is probably the most commonly used term, and intentionally targeting a civilian or a civilian structure that is occupied only by civilians, something like that. And the latter is what's clearly out of bounds.
Good examples of that are, there are World War II movies, showing the, bombing of Germany. It's like, okay, we want to hit where they're manufacturing the airplanes. We don't want to bomb the school next door.
Right.
So don't drop the bombs too early because we don't want to bomb a bunch of kids. Versus indiscriminately firing V2 rockets into England, and you don't care what they hit. Like, not okay.
Yeah.
Or Persian Gulf War I, the Iraqis, after we hit one of their targets, they put up signs that said this was a baby milk factory, and the entire world went like, yeah, right, you wrote that in English, we don't believe you. So things like that of, if you put your weapons plant in the school, you've made the school a military target, and stuff like that is uncomfortable. Pivoting back.
No, I was going to say I have a bone to pick along these lines with the episode of Resistance today, or today's latest episode of Resistance, because there's the episode revolves around what they make out to seem like an unlawful targeting. It's a shuttle carrying Resistance pilot trainees or recruits, and as far as how the Resistance pilots treat those shuttles, they seem to suggest that they're out of bounds. They're not fair targets because they're unarmed. And, as unfortunate as it may be for those folks to be on those shuttles, just like all the Resistance escapees in The Last Jedi on the unarmed shuttles, once you're a combatant, you're a combatant. and unless they've given up their
they
status.
They weren't refugees, right?
That's correct.
I also watched the episode before too. I mean, and if that was the situation where they were refugees leaving a battle scene, that would have been a much different. But they were members of the resistance. They were trainees. They were recruits for the resistance. So they were legitimate targets as far as the First Order was concerned.
Right. And I think the difference, Josh, to bring it back to the original point, is that as Jannah describes this situation at Ansett Island, there was no gray area, right? These were civilians. It seemed unquestionable.
Which is a big difference. And now the idea of an entire company saying, no, we're not going to do this. It'd be interesting to know the exact timing, if this was pre or post Hosnian Prime.
Right.
Because if it's pre-Hosnian Prime, that actually shows that somehow morality, is alive and well within all these folks who were in Company 77 of like, wait a minute, we can't just like murder civilians. If it's post-Hosnian Prime, that probably would give them a little bit more sensitivity to like, we just killed billions of people on multiple planets in the Hosnian system.
Maybe we're on the wrong side.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, we were here supposed to bring order and we just butchered billions. Like, again, that makes people question what they're doing when something of that magnitude happens. Or if you watch, the Huck speech with him spitting and screaming, like that also can give people pause to go like, I don't like this. Like there's, this doesn't look orderly. This doesn't look sane. This looks like we're just butchering people. And so again, interesting question on timing on like, when did they throw down their weapons?
And that seems to be the biggest threat that Kylo and Hux seem to cut to it in that very quick interaction, The Force Awakens, because after they realize it's Finn that deserted and helped Poe escape, you get that back and forth where Kylo kind of needles him and says, well, perhaps Supreme Leader Snoke should consider a clone army. And Hux snaps back that his men are exceptionally trained and programmed from birth. And it gets to the core of their goal is to instill absolute loyalty, unquestioning loyalty to whatever order is given. So there's no judgment whatsoever. It's if A, then B. If the order is given, then you execute. No questions asked. And the threat of that, I think, is ever. Kylo certainly recognizes that. Can you program out morality? And you see that there's this interesting tidbit in, I think it's the first season of Resistance. There's an episode where they end up knocking out a stormtrooper who stays knocked out he keeps getting re-knocked out as the episode goes along because Kaz needs his armor to do some spying. And the First Order gets wind that this stormtrooper is acting weird and his programming might be off. And so they say something along the lines of like they order him to go for a brain scrub or a skull scrub, some awful term like that, meaning, hey, we'll send you right back into this awful conditioning process if there's any threat to our overall goal here.
Yeah, they sound delightful, wonderful at holiday parties, and the type of people you want to have around.
A skull scrape, I think, is what it was called. As awful as that seems.
Yeah, because again, it raises issues of a missed opportunity that they could have had with Rise of Skywalker. Because when you think of Finn, it's like, okay, he helps Poe escape, and like he's a kidnapped, victim. When they escape in their TIE fighter, they kill like 50 guys on the hangar deck. Theoretically, all people who were kidnapped.
Combatant.
It's like they're not victims; they are one now. But yeah, they like it kind of skips that, and an opportunity that they could have had was like a radio-free Finn of him doing broadcasts, of trying to win over stormtroopers, because in my view, the best way to recruit for the resistance is from the First Order. Throw in the end of The Last Jedi, where the Supreme Leader has just been humiliated in front of all of his men. And, that's a source of inspiration for others in the galaxy to rise up. And you could have that message going out from freed stormtroopers, so like, you don't have to live like this. And, just as we did during the Cold War with Radio Free Europe, just being able to have that message. And they completely ignore that. And so that's a disappointment and a missed creative opportunity. But at least having Company 77 have their own free will to recognize right from wrong. And while I appreciate Finn saying like, oh, it was the Force that you all felt, how about now it was just morality of knowing we shouldn't kill civilians? But just my 2 cents.
The Rebels cartoon did a little bit of the, Radio Free Europe type, where the Rebels had, hijacked the HoloNet and sent various messages as part of a recruitment, and that was done very, very effectively by the Rebels in that cartoon.
Exactly, and again, it would have been interesting for the film to have had that be a factor in order to show either the resistance building up with people leaving the First Order, or at least for, communities to rise up. Like having and my brother, shared this, and he's down in LA, screenwriter, and his view was, they could have used what happened in The Last Jedi as kind of an Arab Spring on all the planets that the First Order is basically holding hostage, showing that governance is hard. It's easy to scream and go murder people, but actually collecting taxes and making sure water runs, that takes work. And again, just a missed opportunity to show recruiting for the resistance, and to try to bring back people who are clearly victims of the First Order because they were kidnapped as children, for them to recognize right for wrong. Because could be an interesting insanity defense argument for those who've been taken, skull scraped, or whatever horrific term that the First Order used for how they treated people. And, whether it's like deprogramming from a cult or just getting somebody out of a bad situation, because it's like the worst kind of peer pressure of, go ahead, turn the dial up to 90 because he got the answer wrong. But let's talk about they use the word desertion. And, Judge, would their term of desertion, would you agree with the use of that term, or would you use another phrase because of, these were people who were kidnapped as children deciding to leave? So is it desertion or is it something else?
I mean, if I remember my UCMJ, there's 3 main, leaving type of situations. You have missing a movement, which is your ship is going off and you're not at the deck on time. There's AWOL, where you're absent without leave, but you do intend usually with AWOL to come back. You might have taken an extra weekend, maybe an extra week. Once you've reached the level of desertion, it's generally your intent is to not come back. And they were members of a military, and their intent was to not come back. So as far as the First Order is concerned, they would be deserters. As far as the resistance is concerned, they would be welcomed in open arms to join the resistance, the rebels, whatever you want to call them, and clearly their leaving the First Order would be found to be justifiable. So it would depend very much on who caught them.
Thomas, do you have some thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, the judge hit the nail on the head. And what I would say as well is, because the First Order would consider themselves at war, that's considered an aggravated offense. So there's a difference between desertion in peacetime and desertion in wartime. the wartime status being an aggravated factor that, at least under the UCMJ, would allow for a death penalty. So it becomes a capital offense. I, I can't think of a single desertion case that's been prosecuted as a capital case, because it's just, I would think there would need to, the law doesn't require there to be a nexus between the wartime condition and the desertion, but I think from a trying to avoid nullifying your jury standpoint, you'd need to show something like that. And there, I will say, you do have a related crime called misbehavior before the enemy. That was one that originally, if you recall, Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, the guy that walked off his base in Afghanistan and got promptly captured by the Taliban. That was a charge considered, and he may have had that preferred against him. But effectively, what that offense entails is, if you run away, if you shamefully abandon, surrender, or deliver any command unit place property, it's your duty to defend, or you have some sort of cowardly conduct before the enemy. It's a really wide-ranging offense that doesn't get used very often, but that's one that could also be used and applied sort of in the same situation. I think you'd have an argument for, certainly multiplicity if you're trying to argue. I would think the military judge would strongly consider at least merging the two offenses for purposes of sentencing, because you're getting at the same conduct might constitute two crimes, but it's going to be tricky to try to argue that this person should get double punished for the same act of running away. So, and it's also tricky for the First Order. I think internally they'd make this argument, but if you're taking Jannah's case and they say you misbehaved before the enemy being, I guess, unarmed civilians, what's the argument there? That's not going to fly in a real world court. It's maybe a different situation with Finn, I guess. You could say he should have captured Poe and brought him back to his cell, but instead he runs away with him. I would call that an entrepreneurial use of his pilot skills, but it's the defense attorney in me.
Finn faced his justice in The Last Jedi, and was about the punishment was about to be levied.
There's your capital offense.
Right. When through other things happening, he was able to escape. But clearly the imperial judicial officer there was ready to hand down a very swift sentence in The Last Jedi.
Yeah, skipping the entire judicial process and with just going right to beheading.
Very speedy trial.
Yeah. Again, when you actually have people assigned to execution duty each day, that's also a red flag on that maybe you're on the wrong team. Maybe it's time to leave one afternoon when no one's watching. Just saying. Yeah. Now, firing on civilians, as we've established, that's the no-no. But what's the normal remedy for being ordered to commit a war crime? And Thomas, do you want to take this first of, you have people who deserted because they were ordered to commit a war crime.
I don't want to get too deep into real world stuff here, but it's insane to me that this conversation has happened on the national stage about real world events relatively recently. And what do you do in the face of, say, in order to attack a cultural site or something like that in a country? There are a few options, and I would say it is a risky proposition no matter which way you go. The question, I should say, all orders are given the presumption of legality out of the gate. It sort of has to be that way, because on a day-to-day basis, you don't want soldiers like questioning every single order from their commander about whether that's lawful. Well, the commander told me to go back to my barracks room, but it's the middle of the workday, and that means I wouldn't be doing work. So is that lawful? You don't want that sort of thing to grind the military to a halt. At the same time, you want military members to have that moral compass that the First Order is trying to drive out, and be able to think about things. But in terms of how it's treated legally, the question of whether an order is lawful is a question of law. So the judge, say if you got court-martialed, you, Josh, refuse to obey your First Order commander's order to fire, that's going to have to get sorted out by the military judge. It's not going to be left to the panel or the military jury to decide that. So there's not going to be this like emotional sway or swing. The judge is going to have to correctly apply the law there and come down on it. But I said there's a risk because you're potentially walking yourself into a court-martial if the command chooses to do that by refusing it. And I could think of no better example than the My Lai massacre. I mean, you know, the folks that stood up to the Lieutenant Callies of the world were sticking their neck out there. I mean, one of the reasons that it was clearly the right decision to make to step in and stop this thing, but from a professional standpoint, from a personal safety standpoint, it was a very, very risky, very gallant thing to do, to step in and stop this, because you don't know. I mean, the command has the discretion on what to do with you afterwards in terms of what, you know, how to bring justice and what that would look like. So you could very easily face a court-martial. I would argue that from a certain point of view, Sergeant Bergdahl faced the same decision. He's faced with a command that won't listen to him and his words, and it's this toxic environment, and he feels that he has no other option but to walk off the base and go to his superiors, and you know, that's a wrong thing to do, but you know, he ends up where he is. So it's a tricky situation. I would say when you're in that situation, it's probably an instantaneous call. You could escalate it to the next echelon. That's why this talk that's happened recently in the real world is so fascinating and kind of grim, because it, you know, if the command is coming from the very top, what do you do but refuse if you know it to be an illegal order? So a lot of that's instilled through training and real intensive exercises and getting to know what right looks like.
So I did a bunch of research on illegal orders after the Captain America Winter Soldier and the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episodes that followed. And one of the things that I read in one of the early 19th century cases that actually dealt with Aaron Burr was an illegal order is illegal on its face. It's something that, you know, we're not supposed to just shoot civilians. And there was a case post-World War II that I'm pretty sure it was in Europe, where the officer who was, you know, the highest ranking at whatever scene this was, they had some guy on the ground face down, and this enlisted person was ordered to shoot the guy in the back. And you know, the response from, you know, the trial was, that was clearly an illegal order. Like, when you're told to shoot a guy in the back of the head who's lying face down on the ground, that's an illegal order. Don't do it. And so it should theoretically pass the smell test pretty quick of, we don't kill people's families in order to make the terrorists go away. Like, that's a war crime, and thus you shouldn't do it. So it's, from my read of the law, it sounds like it's a really bright line that you should be able to tell that this is illegal on its face. Sure, there could be weird gray situations in combat where people might question things, but even, you know, My Lai, you would think that's clear on its face of, these are all unarmed civilians. Why do you want us to shoot them? But again, Star Wars being able to raise complex issues for Company 77. And am I not the only one who sees all the little homages they did to either 77 or 42 in Rise of Skywalker?
I have my 77 shirt on.
As you should. Since the 49ers are playing right now, I have the red Star Wars t-shirt on because, again, that's
sorry to your if the score is the same as when I left it, or even worse. But clearly, the your team there was drumming your co-founders team there.
Yeah.
That's true. She will not be happy.
So Jazz, sorry to you and your fellow cheeseheads out there.
Perhaps you should consider a clone army for your football team. Just get Aaron Rodgers' DNA and put him at every position.
Back to the unlawful orders discussion. What clearly, today's military, today's army, travel with lawyers for this reason. There are JAG officers that are assigned to most commanders and detachments, and you also have an added, little tech area where a lot of the fighting isn't necessarily, it's not just pointing the gun at the guy's head in World War II. You have people that are literally stateside controlling a drone that's in the Middle East, and they're told to, yes. And clearly when before they hit that, take out button, there are a lot of layers that have to be done before that final okay is given. But, if the order is to take out that building, you as the person with the joystick, I don't know, I haven't ever been in that situation. I don't know how much you know about what's in that building and who you're taking out.
Yeah. And that was my job in Afghanistan for 12 months, was advising on these operations. And it's a mixed bag. In some situations, you have an offensive operation, that being one that's planned in advance. There's a whole process that mission goes through where from conception to execution, and you've got an operational law attorney, a military attorney that specializes in that stuff, plugged in along the way to include as the mission is getting executed. You also have a lot of really fluid situations. I probably lost count of the situations where, we'd have a UAV on station and we're looking at what could be a target. Say it's might be a civilian structure, it might be a shed, but it also might be a weapons cache. What do? You got to size up the factors. You're rapidly going through that analysis, and I think the misconception that a lot of people have is that the soldier that's on the ground with bullets flying over his head is having to wait for some lawyer somewhere in a command center to give the green light, and that's patently not true at all. But in situations where we do have the time to take a look at it, and I'm not always saying it's this long deliberative process, but where you've got the opportunity to weigh the factors and put some brains together before you pull the trigger, that's done. Because there is nobody wants civilian casualties. Nobody wants to destroy civilian property and deal with all the unfortunate consequences and ripple effects that come with that sort of thing. We're not like Grand Admiral Thrawn just, pulling up over a town and laying waste to it to get what we need to get. And so it's just a fascinating process when you break it down.
Yeah, the Empire or First Order doesn't do the analysis of like, well, there's one guy in that cafe and there's 50 other people, so let's wait for him to come out and we'll use the sharpshooter as opposed to using the drone to blow up the entire cafe and get
Commence
50.
primary ignition, just blow up the planet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
No better example than Alderaan.
yeah, it's just, maybe we should put some troops down and find where the collaborators are, as opposed to just blow up the entire planet.
And it's like a whole big thing. You got to gas up the shuttle, and everybody's got to get their gear together. Why not just push this trigger button?
We built this big Death Star with this planet-killing laser. What do you mean we can't use it? Again, when you build the super weapon, what do you expect to happen? And again, we saw that again with another planet-killing weapon. This time with 150 Star Destroyers each having said planet-killing weapon. But there was no analysis before they blew up. The victim planet in Rise of Skywalker.
No, and that
There,
goes back
there
to
seems to be
Emperor
no
gives you.
shortage in planet-killing weapons on the Imperial side.
Yeah, I would actually prefer them not to have planet-killing weapons. It worked in The Last Jedi, but why don't you just have like a continent-killing weapon? It's like, they blow a chunk off a planet, and the granted the planet would be ruined, a nuclear winter would set in, and you wouldn't be able to live on it anymore, and that probably would be more terrifying than just blowing up a planet,
Well,
because
we learned that the Death Star had that capacity
Yeah.
in Rogue One, where they only targeted the city. So,
Mhm.
they could have pigeonholed and chose their targets a little bit more selectively if they wanted to with the Death Star.
And you saw even in Return of the Jedi, it precision targeted individual capital ships. So they certainly had the ability. They just had no real interest in using it that way.
It'd be like using a nuclear weapon when you could accomplish the same goal with a drone. It's like, do we blow up the cafe, or do we just take out the Tri-City area with a nuke? And that, I don't know if people really comprehend that when watching these fantasy films of like we're talking about it. I know others talk about the psychology and other issues presented in this, but I would hope others think about the like real world application of, oh, just because we have the ability to flatten a city, maybe do we have to? And to do that analysis, because it is, again, just saying like we'll target 52 of your target, we have 52 targets and that's what we'll do. It's like,
When Star
I would
Wars has never ever shied away from that. I mean, they don't necessarily talk about it in the explicit terms that we do, but those moral tugs of war are there. I mean, I can think of no better example than in on Edu in Rogue One, where the mission on one hand you've got the ethical question of this assassination mission to kill Galen Erso, but during the mission, rebel forces that were scrambled from Yavin 4 end up killing a civilian. They kill Galen Erso. Well, depends on how you could see him in a variety of ways. But in Jyn Erso's eyes, that was my dad. He wasn't, he was basically a prisoner, and you guys killed this unlawful target. So these issues happen right before their eyes, and that's why I love talking about this stuff, because it makes me, I done this stuff for a living as the two of you have as well, and it makes me watch all of these things in a different light.
Yeah. I'm a civilian, so I've never had to deal with anything that
But I mean
like
the
that.
law generally, like you,
Yeah.
I say that broadly, but still,
Yeah, I am well read on case law. I do it for fun. Uh, but yeah, no, I've never had to make a hard call. My calls are, is that privileged or not? And let's make sure the privilege log explains everything. Yeah, I've never had life and death on the line or military service. So yes, that's why we bring you guys in order to talk about these deep issues. Uh, and good, again, because good analysis with Rogue One, because that gets into the targeted killing of a specific individual. And while the DOJ did come up with a white paper analysis on when we could do a drone strike to take out a U.S. citizen who's working with Al Qaeda, I don't think that would pass the 4 or 5 factor test for killing Galen Erso, because there were other means to be able to capture him. Capture was not impossible, provided that was the original order given to Cassian Andor. And then, the general walked out and gave him secret instructions, outside of Mon Mothma's earshot, which again always bothered me, And that could actually be a good war crimes trial for someone if we ever wanted to get into that one of whether or not that was a lawful killing.
But again, once again, playing out right before us in real life in the last month, dealing with the targeting of an Iranian general, and wherever you fall on the line as whether that or not that was justified or not. And I clearly have a strong personal opinion, which I'm not allowed to share. But the fact of the matter is, it clearly just played out in the real world.
Yes. And again, odd timing having movies and TV shows that get into this, where people can talk about it and talk about how the rules work and whether or not that was lawful or justified, or what to do if you've been ordered to commit a war crime, and or what the person at the trigger thinks is a war crime. And what
He's
Okay,
ready for his
okay.
brain scrape.
Exactly.
kind of want to mine one of those eventually myself. Yeah. I mean, I do have, again, this is great radio, but the Schoolhouse Rock on the still
I love it.
plushie.
That's great.
Yeah, it was a gift from another legal geek after Comic-Con this past year. But yes, I do love this. Good 70s child. So a lot to unpack there when it comes to these issues of war crimes, desertion, kidnapping, aggressive recruitment, and really, really appreciate both of you sharing your thoughts and knowledge from your service on whether how this would play out from the fictional world of Star Wars. So, Your Honor, Thomas, thank you both for joining, and everyone, please rate us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to your podcast. Don't forget, we have a Patreon, so you can check us out there. And stay geeky, America.